these extreme systems tend not to be like very sustainable in the long term. Even if you're paying like very exploitative wages, if you are paying some wages that allow people to save money and eventually send their children to college, people are more able eventually to advocate for higher wages.
Productivity is a very relative measure when we're talking about like the worth of the goods produced, in large part because the worth of goods can be determined by a number of extrinsic factors that don't necessarily relate to the level of development within a given like system. So, for example, like things like regional exclusivity, things like local labor laws or the local minimum wage, things like the trade relations with other countries or exploitative business deals like made with the IMF or the World Bank. These can all affect the perceived value of the production of a given factory or firm in ways that don't actually relate at all to its efficiency in terms of its actual production. When we take a look at like total resources extracted from different parts of the world, there is no, say for example, there's only one cobalt mine in all the world, right? Now that's not true, of course, but say that was the case, and it's somewhere in Sudan, and I don't know. Folks, there ain't going to get paid too much. Now, the world needs cobalt. And no matter how efficiently that cobalt mine mines cobalt, I imagine given the fact that it's the only mine, there would probably be Western businesses making sure they have the highest end technology in doing so. The people who work there ain't going to get paid that much. And technically, if you compare them to the production efficiency of the rest of the world, they're the most efficient producer of cobalt. No one else even comes close. They're the only game in town, but they don't get paid very much for their labor. And the reason for that is because even though in a comparative sense their efficiency, their productivity is unrivaled in that field, they are in Sudan. As that's an extrinsic factor unrelated to their efficiency, their productivity in any meaningful sense. They will get paid very little, possibly nothing, even if a firm of the same comparative efficiency could have workers who are paid a tremendous amount if it was in Alaska or, something like that. You know what I mean? That's the only point I was trying to illustrate. There are so many like other things that go into what people are paid, if they're paid their worth, so to speak, than just the productive efficiency of a firm.
I mean, I think you're right. Studies on worker productivity, they rely on like assumptions that there is at least some semblance of free market competition and operating markets here. If you go back to like the feudal system, the productivity of workers is like might be very decoupled from their actual wages. Or if you look at like slavery, where people are literally being paid nothing, or like an authoritarian country that is able to just like use guns to be like, listen, guys are going to work and like you're not allowed to leave this land, this is the only job offering that you have, even if you are going to get paid for it, you don't really have an option like not to take it because this is the one thing that our government's going to allow you to do by cooperating with whatever foreign company is paying us to have access to our labor capital. Yeah, I think that like in sort of these extreme examples where the system is like a very unique and especially exploitative, there's decoupling from worker productivity. If you're going to argue with more economically minded people about this, of which frankly I'm not one of these people who's like super good in economics, I think the
Me
point,
either.
yeah, I think the point that they would make is that like these extreme systems tend not to be like very sustainable in the long term. So like if you look at like Bangladesh and like sweatshops, even if you're paying like very exploitative wages, if you are paying some wages that allow people to save money and eventually send their children to college and have transfer of wealth between generations and accumulation of wealth, what ends up happening is people are more able eventually to advocate for higher wages and to develop skills that allow them to build industries within their countries. And so the more economically minded people would point out that it's hard to keep this very exploitative system going on for long unless you have total control of like violence, and the ability to like really exert force or like prevent people from moving between industries or control their wealth entirely, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it's a snowball rolling down a hill situation. Um, a lot of people use like productivity between countries as a measurement of like entrepreneurship or like industry-minded behavior. But, the United States is always going to be more economically productive in any measurable sense than countries with lower levels of development because obviously they don't have the development necessary to produce the stuff that allows them to develop faster. I mean, it's just, it feeds into itself. But people use it like a prescriptive thing, like when people say stuff like, well, the reason people in America are wealthier is because than people in Africa is because they're more productive. It's a very reductive statement to make. There are a lot of reasons and explanations for that, of course. There are people who have no productive value at all, but are enormously wealthy through inheritance. Yeah, it's not the only factor, but also there's an inherent there's an implied level of sort of prescriptive judgment there, like, well, why is America on top? Well, I guess they're just more productive, even though productivity in an economic sense is self-referential, productivity begets productivity. In a colloquial sense, what people tend to talk about when they say productivity is like workmanship, efficiency, drive, entrepreneurship. And I don't think there's any more or less drive or entrepreneurship in Africa than there is in Europe, Probably, honestly, more of it in Europe, or sorry, in more of it in Africa, and more of a hard workmanship vibe going on in Africa as well, because they're more at threat of death and they don't have robust welfare states. There might actually be a greater degree of desperate individual, striving for attainment over there, the grind set, if it were, than what you might get from the average European. So the solution, of course, is reinvestiture. It's investment, development. But sometimes people act like the reason they don't have that development is because they're lacking something. That bothers me.
Colloquially, the way that people use productivity, how hardworking someone is. And that's definitely not what economists mean when they use this word. It's frustrating to talk about because it definitely trips people up in ways that are frustrating. Because like, if you look at someone who is mining diamonds in the Congo, they're clearly working extremely hard and to great threat to their own personal health. And yet, like, the productivity measurements for diamonds, it turns out that like the value of diamonds is very much determined by things like marketing that happen in the United States. So like when some marketing team in the United States is able to convince Americans that they want to buy diamonds, and therefore translate into millions of sales, their work gets recorded as like very productive because it ends up with a lot of consumption basically. And the work of people mining diamonds in the Congo ends up getting recorded as not productive because when you look at like the total value of the diamonds, 90% of it is coming from the marketing team. And so like that would be an example of how productivity in the econ sense is like very different from actually like working hard or any sort of like moral prescription, because like clearly these people in the Congo are working very hard, and the marketing people might just like come up with how to do this in an evening.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's just from an economic perspective, the statement, people in this country make less money than people in this country because they're less productive, is like tautological. Because in that case, wages are going to relate to like the internal economic activity, which relates directly to the productivity. It's basically like saying, well, this country has more wealth because it has a higher GDP. It's like, well, yeah, of course, they're right there. Those numbers are very directly connected. But there's obviously other stuff. You could take the same factory with the same workers, in America and move it on over to Mexico, and they could produce stuff at the same rate. And of course, those people would be paid less. Obviously, more goes into this than just efficiency. That's one of the reasons why people's wages vary based on the minimum wage set in different states. If everything was determined exclusively by efficiency or productivity, then that wouldn't be the case. But oh god, I'm remembering when What If Alt History made the claim that baristas who work for Starbucks get paid more if they serve more customers per hour. That was a good one. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point, but yeah, that was a very, very insular moment there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with like Starbucks baristas is that their productivity is highly determined by the capital that they work with. So like the ability of like Starbucks to hire programmers and engineers to build machines which allow Starbucks baristas to make coffees. That's really like the bulk of how Starbucks baristas manage to make different drinks at different rates. And so like the productivity of a Starbucks barista is mostly determined by capital investment that is outside of their control. And therefore, this is like a good reason, as well as like the fact that it's a fairly low skill job. These are like the kind of economic reasons why their individual productivity might not translate into wages. If I can just like push back a little bit, I would say that like the longer that you work at Starbucks, like, and your ability to retain that job is dependent on your ability to produce coffees at a certain, adequate rate or a high rate. And like that's also correlated with like increasing wages whenever you get your performance reviews. So like there is correlation between how many macchiatos you can make per hour and your wages at Starbucks. It's just the correlation is not necessary. I don't know the numbers. I'm guessing it's not super strong because that portion of productivity only accounts for like a small portion of how fast they're able to make the drinks, and the rest of it is accounted for by capital.
Well, people get raises in most of these service joints by seniority, and even then they're incredibly small, but I don't think there's any correlation to their level of skill. They might get promoted to like front end or back end manager, like closing, shift lead, something like that. And that might include a pay raise. I think that would depend on the place, but it could. Though the amount of extra responsibility you're dealing with on account of that is much greater than the amount of extra pay you're going to be getting as well. I don't think the correlation I think is quite weak as well, especially since the people who are getting paid the most, they're the manager. Oftentimes do quite a bit less in terms of like day-to-day work. That depends on the location. Sometimes managers do quite a lot. Yeah, I don't think there's a meaningful correlation there. I think that if you take a look at society as an aggregate, the harder people work, the less they tend to get paid. Because usually it's poor people who have to work multiple jobs, stack up 8 to 10 to 12 hours to work while going to college, stuff like that. The people who make a lot of money don't have to work through their entire lives. And you have exceptions, of course. There are like Sigma grindset lawyers who like sleep underneath their desk. Of course there are exceptions. It's not a total thing, just an aggregate average. But that's how hard you work to wages, not productivity to wages. But in terms of productivity, I mean, how do you abstract some of this stuff? What's the productivity of a CEO? They don't produce anything. Sometimes they don't even really make decisions. They just operate as like a front end. It's difficult to economically calculate stuff like this in any meaningful sense, because a lot of these econ evaluations are just like, how many widgets do you make per hour? They're very cut down, very not service economy oriented. Good for like nationwide aggregates, not very good at individual person to person determiners of predicted income.
On the CEO level, it's hard to measure because there's not a lot of CEOs and their work tends to be very different. But the way that you would measure it is like how much value they're adding to the company. When you say something that like the hardest working people tend to be earning very little, I think that's sort of true. And the reason why it's true is productivity is basically how much value you can create. There are other ways to measure it, but like per hour of work is the typical one. And if you're able to produce a ton of value per hour of work, then yeah, like the reality is you probably don't need to work that much. And so the more productive you are, the more you can get away with not working for super long. In regards to like CEOs, yeah, I mean, it varies quite a lot because different CEOs have different positions in the company, or like different responsibilities and different like ownership of the company. So like in theory, the way that it would work is a board of directors interviews and like hires on a CEO, and they're willing to pay that CEO a certain amount of money up to potentially the value they create for the company. And so you would probably measure it that way. And how much they actually receive is probably a fairly good metric, especially for CEOs, of how productive they are.
But that's absolutely not true. There's no correlation at all between the compensation a CEO gets and their productivity in the economic sense we're referring to. CEOs, even if a company devalues over a given length of time, they still make their pay. Now, a devaluing a company through your leadership is a negative contribution. Technically, they're being less productive than the lowest barista underneath them, and they still get paid many, many millions, you know? The tie that a CEO gets to their productivity is in the stock options they receive, increasing in value, you know, what they're paid in. And often CEOs are paid largely in stock options, but the stock value of a company also isn't the same as productivity. When we talk about productivity, we're talking about the actual generated value to others. Tesla has a higher corporate value on the stock market than a bunch of other car companies, but it produces significantly less because the stock market is really, really hype generated. So the issue I have here is I just don't think there's like any correlation at all. I think it's very, very spurious. How hard people work, how productive they are, these are really, really hard to pin down between different fields. At a point, I don't think there's any use, any relevance to this mode of analysis beyond like a really general, like firm or nationwide analysis. When you try to apply it to individuals, you know, I think it falls apart. America on average is more productive than Mexico, and we do make on average more money. But if you get down to the individual, you know, members of both countries, I think you'll find enough variance that it gets really blurry.
So again, it depends on the CEO and what exactly their compensation framework is. So I think in theory, it's possible for a CEO to just take higher and higher compensation rates year after year, even as their company value plummets, right? And they make less money. But if they keep doing that, like eventually the company's going to go bankrupt. So, and eventually the board will fire them. So again, it's like possible that like a CEO, it's totally possible that a CEO controls the majority of the stocks and they just like set all of the policies unilaterally, and they've just decided to like plunder whatever they can from a company as they run it into the ground.
What
So
if they just do a bad job, though?
if they do a bad job, again, you'd expect the board to fire them because the board wants to make money. They're profit motivated, and if a CEO is not returning profits to them, they're not going to like that.
They would still make tens of millions. Usually there's a golden parachute even after a few years a CEO goes down, which means they would have received tens of millions of dollars for contributing negative perceived productivity, whereas at least the lowest minimum wage earning barista underneath them would have contributed some positive.
Yeah, but the board doesn't want that to happen. Like they
Well,
want to get their
sure, but
money's
it
worth.
happens
So like,
though.
yeah, you can have happens, or like you can also pay a barista like 1,000 times what you would otherwise and like lose value on them. Or you could do this with like anyone in the company, where you just like pay them much more than the value they produce. But it would be like a bad deal. The company doesn't want to do this. The board is not incentivized to do this. And so you'd expect like on aggregate them to avoid situations where the CEO just like takes money from them and doesn't deliver value back to the company.
Well, that's common. CEOs get paid a lot, and many businesses go defunct. It happens every year. We hear stories of businesses going down or losing money in a quarter. Their CEOs continue to make lots of money. It doesn't seem like there's any relationship at all between them making a metric fuck ton of money and their productivity in an economic sense. Again, assuming you can even extrapolate productivity to refer to a corporation's evaluation on in the stock market, because even then, I think that's a very speculative relationship between those two factors. But I just don't think there's a relationship. Whether or not the company goes up or down, the CEO makes a hell of a lot more money than the people beneath them. If it goes down, maybe they don't stay in that position for as long, but they still made millions while contributing negative productivity. It's just a deeply unfair system, but we have to recognize it's unfair to fix it.
I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm inclined to believe that these people are very profit driven and want to generate like as much money as they can. And so they're willing to like they're not going to want to take like these sort of bad deals.
But it happens anyway.
I do agree that like CEOs fail and companies fail, and like sometimes you can hire someone on with the promise that they're going to generate all of this value and make a bad call ultimately, and they don't generate that value. The board isn't happy. The CEO eventually, you know, when the company fails, is no longer making that money. I just think that like given the option, if these people could choose, you know, they could see the future, they would choose to make more money. long
Well,
term.
I'm not denying that. I'm only saying I don't think there's a strong relationship between economic productivity and wages. If they continue to make their wages millions while being unproductive, contributing negative productivity, the intentions or will of the stock of the shareholders isn't really relevant to the, you know.
Gosh, why would a board like they don't want that to happen though?
Oh, wait, I'm not saying they want it to happen. Only that it does happen.
Okay,
It
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 does
happens,
happen.
and when it happens, they still make a lot of money doing it. So there's not a strong relationship between their productivity and the wages they receive.
But you agree that the incentives are for them to create value. Like everyone wants the CEO to create value. They don't want them to lose value for the company, right?
Yeah, but what they want is irrelevant. We're talking about the relationship between productivity and wages. If there was a strong relationship, CEOs that contribute negative productivity should receive negative wages, or at the very least, nothing. But of course, it doesn't work that way, because life doesn't work that way. Productivity doesn't chart onto wages, or vice versa. At least not at an individual level. At a broad aggregate, it seems like a decent determiner, as long as by productivity we're using the economic measure and not the colloquial measure, because I think that people are just as hard working all over the world, uh,
Well,
more or less.
I also think that you can find lots of individual examples of productivity and compensation not mapping onto each other. But it seems like you agree that on aggregate, this is true in the economic sense. So do you think it's just like not true for CEOs, but is true for other employees? Or
I think it's true if you look at a country, like the difference between country to country. But if you take a look at the difference between different individual workers, or even maybe even different firms within a country, things kind of fall apart. Oh, between states as well, right? Seattle has a $15 minimum wage. Broader Washington doesn't. Idaho has a lower minimum wage than Washington, I think. So, two workers doing the same shit in Starbucks in Seattle and in Idaho can get paid very, very different amounts with no difference in productivity on average. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it really falls apart when you get any more specific than nationwide.
so the reason why I don't know, I'm not the biggest fan of this like state by state comparison is just because there's quite big differences in like the cost of living between states. And so like oftentimes you'll look at like a city where you have a high minimum wage, so you like $15 minimum wage. And then you compare that to somewhere like Missouri or Alabama in the rural countryside, and you're like, wow, these baristas are making a lot less money. And like the reason why they're making less money is because like the coffees that they're selling are also going to be lower cost. And the way that productivity measured is like relative to those areas. I think that like you're right if you're saying that like government policy can change how people are compensated in a way that the market wouldn't necessarily result in. Like that can happen, but I think that we should like be careful not to like exaggerate this effect too much when we compare state by state.
With respect, that ain't true at all. There are plenty of fast food places that charge the same amount no matter what state you're in or the minimum wage. The wages change though. And so the traffic can as well. You can have a red state city with a low minimum wage, getting very high traffic, selling burgers at the same price as an area in a blue state with a higher minimum wage that's rural and has basically no traffic. I don't think these factors track on at all. Now, when you say cost of living is lower, that I agree with, but that's not productivity. That's a different economic force. What they think they can get away with paying people based on the relative cost of living there. Though, of course, I don't think it's enough. Not in any minimum wage place, um, but yeah, that's a different factor. If the statement were to say, I think that wages will correlate with the cost of living in an area, then I agree on a nationwide level. I would also agree that's a very strong determining factor.
Yeah, I just think that like sometimes it's difficult to compare state by state because there's a lot of factors that go into wages. Um, and you can look at like wages in a specific state, and the reason why they might be like higher or lower has a lot to do with labor supply, and that is tied into cost of living and the local economy. For example, in a city, if you have like a very high traffic area, which you brought up, these areas are, in the economic sense, they're going to be more productive because the worker is going to see more people. And so like it makes sense for them to receive a higher wage. And you do see that in like big
But I said,
cities.
even in a rural blue area as opposed to a city red area, a person in the blue area might sell far fewer products because there are fewer people in the area than a person who makes less money but sells more products at the same price to a greater number of people in the red area.
Yeah, and so part of that is because of competition between businesses. So like if you have, say someone produces like, we'll use like widgets, right? So say someone produces 10 widgets per hour, right? And there's only one business which is hiring widget producers. Because they're the only like widget producer, they can like get away with paying less because they have like this monopsony power, right? But if you have multiple businesses, say like two widget producing businesses that are next to each other, what they're willing to do is they're willing to pay up to the price of 10 widgets per hour for the employee and move those workers that would work for their competitor over to them. And so if you have like lots of businesses that are together and they're competing in this way, they're going to be willing to pay more for these widget producing laborers. And that's because of like the relative ratio of widget producing companies to labor supply. And so when you talk about like something like Starbucks, right, where like potentially there's a lot of labor supply, and you look at like an area where there are businesses which are hiring and they got to sort of compete for the same labor pool of people, they're going to be willing to potentially pay more up to the productivity level.
This doesn't happen.
It does
People
happen
pay
though.
No, wait, people get paid minimum wage in big cities. I worked in LA. People get
Mhm.
paid minimum wage in LA, even though there's an enormous like competition between all these businesses. It can happen sometimes, but like the issue is my only argument here is that like on an individual level, productivity is not a great determiner for what a person is paid. But if your argument is that competition will drive potential like pay up, then why are rural underserved franchises in blue states with a higher minimum wage paying people more than highly productive franchises in red states that have a lower minimum wage. The only point I'm making is that there are a ton of factors that contribute to what like pay workers get that have nothing to do with productivity at all. That it has to do with other factors like cost of living or like the law, like legally. Because I think all these businesses would be paying us like bottles full of piss if they could get away with it. If you get the minimum wage higher, then people will be paid higher amounts, even if there's no change in their productivity. And it's impossible to measure productivity anyway in any like cross-disciplinary respect. How do you measure the productivity of a barista, a service worker, next to an Amazon warehouse fulfillment employee? What percentage of the worth of every delivery could be attributed to the productivity of the worker who delivers it? Is it all of it? Because without them, it wouldn't have made it there. There would have been no point to the entire enterprise. It's not really, there's no way. It's just not at the end of the day, like this is precisely the reason why the whole the entirety of economics, the line between prescriptive and descriptive, I think, gets really, really, really muddied and really dumb. I just think we should fight for higher wages. We should fixate on that because trying to work out like the precise mathematical equation to determine, why things are the way they are, it always feels very Econ 101. Like if we, if every cow is a frictionless sphere, what are people's wages going to be? That kind of thing. What does that give us?
Yeah. So I mean, there may be like a point to this like very abstract way of having the conversation. Because like I haven't looked into like these studies between these companies, but you ask like why are these blue state rural companies paying more than red state rural companies? And the point that I was trying to make earlier is because these workers have like a value of how much they're producing. And in low competition environments, so like a rural environment where there's not a lot of businesses, you can potentially get away with paying a lot lower for those wages. And so like the reason why you're able
The minimum
to,
wage.
yeah, so the reason why you're able to like set minimum wages higher in like a blue state and have those apply like even to rural companies is because the workers are they are producing more productivity and that isn't tracking on, because that isn't tracking to wages in the red states, because there isn't a lot of competition. And so the government is basically stepping in, and they're raising like the minimum wage, or they're raising like the wages of these workers closer to what their actual productivity is. So
That Oh, sorry. I just want to say I half agree with you there.
yeah, yeah,
Minimum wages are set higher in states that have higher average wealth. But then we're taking a look at like states with millions of people in them, not individual analyses where the whole function breaks down. But if we're looking at why California has a higher minimum wage than Alabama does, I agree. California has way more money moving around. So it would make sense then that they would feel comfortable setting that higher. And that is due to the economic productivity of the state, but not of the individual workers within it, because that minimum wage hike will apply no matter how productive any worker who benefits from it is.
yeah. Yeah, so I guess like the point that I'm trying to make is that you have environments, if there's like very low competition, for example, like monopsony power of, or like some degree of great like company power to negotiate wages, like, which you have in some rural areas, then yeah, I think that you'll especially expect um, wages to not track to productivity. And so the reason I think why that seemed like agreeable to you is because I'm like extending an olive branch of like explaining why this disconnect between wages and compensation might exist.
No, no, yeah, well, I agree. I'm not. My only argument is that it doesn't work that well as a person-to-person determiner, and there are tons of other factors that go into it. The problem with assigning it exclusively to productivity is that it doesn't leave us much room for prescriptive judgment afterwards. If it's like, well, these people, this area makes more because they do more, and this area makes less because they do less. Well, okay, fine, but how do we get at that? And I think there are a number of ways you can get at that with policy, with reinvestment and stuff, which target the problems a little bit more specifically. And of course, I also want to dispel any myth of meritocracy, which I don't believe exists in any meaningful function in this country. So I think it's important to dispel of that. I think that should be like a consistent political goal to be pushed for.
Why don't you think we have meritocracy?
I think it's pretty apparent that when you look at people in power, let's say politics, for example, they're generally pretty mediocre people in the sense that they're morally and sometimes like intellectually kind of bankrupt. A lot of them just came from wealth, which gives them the ability to sort of form the connections and get the educational and business acumen necessary to like push their way into power. I feel the same way about a lot of people in power, just in general. Um, people who are good at sweeping the floors don't get promoted to manager. They get kept sweeping the floors because that's what they're good at. I don't think there's a very strong incentive to push the most competent people in society up to the top. The only time I feel like that was the case was back during the Revolutionary War. I think that warfare, violence, and revolution are effective mediums through which exceptional people can be found. I don't think it's a coincidence that the founding fathers were all big brain geniuses, at least relative to like the average like aristocrat of their day. Those were the people who distinguished themselves in very dire circumstances. You see this often in like revolutionary times during like the USSR or whatever. Whatever you may think of the positions or morals of many revolutionary leaders, they are nothing if not exceptional. But here in America today, most like leaders, both business and political, are bloviating dumbasses who are clearly like more concerned with personal accreditation, book deals, and fucking underage prostitutes than they are with like anything they're supposed to be elected to do.
So if you were to have like a company that did operate on meritocratic principles and, elevated people to positions of power based truly on, their ability to contribute to the company rather than external factors, do you think that company would succeed in the market against companies that weren't doing that?
I don't think any such company could exist because we don't have a meritocratic society from which to pull employees. You can't say we live in a meritocracy when massive differences in wealth, educational accessibility, stuff like that affect uh, the abilities of workers. Oh wait, I'm hearing a fan from your mic.
Sorry. Um,
But anyway, yeah.
yeah, I mean, you can point out that like the ability of people to get into like high paying or like get into good schools, get education and whatnot is, for example, it's like highly dependent on zip code. So like if you are a brilliant person, but again, you're born into a neighborhood that like is stricken by like continual crime and businesses don't want to like set up there and it's really hard to get a job and it's really hard to save money and to go to school and whatnot. Even if you're brilliant, very skilled, you might not necessarily have that recognized. You might not be able to, generate a lot of wealth for yourself. I think we can acknowledge that, but I think we can also say that to the extent that there are people that have varying levels of skills, so like someone who is born into like a decent, into a decent zip code, and they're able to get those educational opportunities, that person, when they enter a company, that company is going to benefit from promoting them up to the ladder to the point where they're able to contribute as much as they're capable of.
Possibly. Even if that was the case, that's not really a meritocracy because we're pre-selecting for people who have benefited from the dice roll of early life. But even under those circumstances, like I said, janitors who sweep the best aren't promoted to manager. If a person's really, really good at being a desk jockey, no matter how talented they might be at higher ups, it's not like corporations are known for taking bold risks and promoting managers from within. Like, that doesn't really happen that much. You have consultants and managers brought over from other firms for a variety of reasons. I'm generalizing, of course. I'm talking about the entirety of corporate culture in the US. So there are going to be exceptions in every direction. But the idea that like everyone's promoted to their point of maximum efficiency is just like, I don't think that's true at all. Because like in order to even try that, you have to experiment. You don't know who's going to be good in a management position. You don't know who would succeed most there. With minimal oversight and very few slots for promotion, the likelihood of any given, exceptional person being given the opportunity to demonstrate that, not to mention office politics, people might not like overperformers because it makes their adjacent departments look bad. I think a life is a lot of luck, and generally speaking, you'll do better if you try hard than if you don't. But a meritocracy, we are not. I think we're very, very far away from that.
If a janitor is incredible at sweeping the floors, that doesn't necessarily mean they have like the merit to become a manager. So I think even in your example, like this person is very skilled at sweeping floors, but isn't promoted to managerial position. I don't think that's an argument against the existence of a meritocracy. If anything, it seems like
But how would you
the
know?
meritocracy is functioning in that case because you're not promoting someone who has not shown a capability for managerial position. You've
That right there is my point exactly. You can't know. You assume because the proletarian functions well at their current role that they must be designed for it. But you have no idea whether that work effort or drive they demonstrate for sweeping would be applicable in a higher field. And we can never know. As long as we live in a system like this, an autocratic economic system, there's absolutely no way to reasonably ensure that people's skills are best demonstrated in these firms.
Yeah, so the way that you like end up doing these hirings is to look at their education attainment, their prior work history, and whatnot. And if someone has worked in a managerial role and can demonstrate success in that role, their ability to get hired in another managerial role, I think you would agree, is increased by that, right?
Well, that's my point exactly. That's the snowball rolling down the hill. People get managerial positions because they've had managerial positions. This is why
Mhm.
companies don't promote from within. They get somebody else who's worked as a manager in another department or sometimes from another company, or they hire a consultant. Um,
So this person who has like those proven managerial skills is getting hired,
Experience.
right? And obviously, like if they were the previous manager and they like tanked their position, right? They're less likely to get hired than if they did a really good job and could demonstrate that.
Everyone's had incompetent managers. I think it's shockingly common to find firms being run by people who know less about the firm than the people who work for the person who runs the firm. I think that happens pretty often. We've all read Dilbert, haven't we? But yeah, like this is the thing, you can't know. The interesting thing is your logic right there is exactly the anti-meritocratic logic I'm pointing out. The criteria you're using to determine whether a person should be a manager is nothing more than if they've been one before and done a fine job, sure, but that's not a recognition of people's skills. That's just inertia. People who were managers can now be managers and continue to be managers. Meanwhile, are there more competent people in that department who could be promoted up? Well, who knows? They do good in their position and they haven't shown the talents of a manager because never been given the chance to, so they'll never get to know. There's no way a system such as this can be considered meritocratic. It's once you have some luck, you keep getting luck unless you fuck something up. On average, of course, not for all people all the time.
So maybe we're using meritocratic in different ways. When I say a system is meritocratic, what I mean is that like ability to demonstrate skills allows you to move up in positions. And so I would say like if you're able to demonstrate a managerial skill, that increases your chance of receiving a managerial position. And I would say that like demonstration of skill translating to promotion is an example of meritocracy. Where I'd agree with you is that like access to getting those skills in the first place is not equal across society. So I would say that like if you grow up again in a zip code that doesn't allow you to generate those skills in the first place, even if you would be a brilliant manager, there's just no way of people to know that, even perhaps for you to know that you'd be an incredible manager if you're never like getting the opportunity to do it. And so I think that we can like agree maybe on that, but then I would say that like once you have demonstrated skills, the ability to like demonstrate skills does translate to changes in position.
There is definitely a correlation, but not a strong enough one for me to be, you can alter the outcome of a game of pachinko depending on where you put you shunt the ball through, but I don't think it's any more than a luck game there. It's always important to try your best, of course, but, if you're a very hard worker at a given position, you may never be given the opportunity to demonstrate that you're managerial material. They're not overlapping skills necessarily. It can't really be found out. And then there's workplace discrimination, of course. People of color get passed up for promotion way more often than white people do. Men more so than women. Cis people more than trans people. And tall people. Tall people more than short people. That's a big one, actually, for men on who gets put forward. So those are pretty statistically significant elements of discrimination, even when you level out like skill as a factor, position or experience or whatever. Yeah, it's just the world is a terribly unfair place. I'm reminded of a quote of a I don't know if it was a neuroscientist, but they said something in an interview, something along the lines of people are always asking me, what do we know about the brain of Einstein? Because Einstein had just died, I think, and I say to them, somehow I am far less interested in the brain of the world's smartest man than I am in the knowledge that there is, without a doubt, a person equally intelligent who lived and died on a field somewhere in Sudan, or something like that. I'm probably butchering that quote somewhat, but I think the sentiment there is very, very poignant. And that's what I tend to believe. I don't care for any of these so-called leaders. I know there are very competent people who aren't in those positions who should be. So I would rather fixate on that. Till that happens, it can't be a meritocracy.
Yeah. I I don't know, because I tend to agree on like some level. I'm very much a fan of meritocracy. And I think that most people ought to be if they're like reasonable people. And they just want to like produce the most for society. You want to have those Einsteins that are, born in impoverished countries to demonstrate their skills, to have the opportunity to. And I think that like within a company, I think you'd agree that like a company has an incentive to make sure that its employees are allowed to be as productive as they can be. And so like if you have hidden talent within, the janitorial people, a company would want to see that if possible and promote people up the ladder. And really, when I'm thinking about a meritocracy, I'm thinking that the incentives in a society are such that the powers that be want to find people who are successful and skilled, and they want to promote them up the ladder. And there may be barriers to that. There are always barriers to that. But I think as long as the incentives are there, the barriers are, aren't such that it never happens. I think that that's how you sort of measure the relative degree of meritocracy.
Who cares about the incentive? If the incentive mattered, there wouldn't have been all those biases with race and gender and height. If incentive mattered, there wouldn't have been any racism in the 50s or, signs saying no blacks allowed because it would have been more profitable to let them in as customers. Always there's an incentive, but we're not rational. And we're also not omniscient. And we would need to be both of those things for the incentive to be an accurate determiner of how good a meritocracy we have. Don't get me wrong, I love the idea of a meritocracy. The reason I believe it doesn't exist now is because I love the idea of a meritocracy. I wouldn't be this concerned with gatekeeping its definition if I didn't believe we could do better.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to hear some like real wacky things, I would say that there's like an active bias against people who have more conservative leanings, especially in academia and entering the professional world. If
That's
you're
good though.
if you're someone who like is more right wing, you have like a strong incentive to hide that, and it's because companies, not only are they hiring on skills, but they're also hiring on like a person's ability to fit into the progressive milieu and hold certain progressive ideas. And I think that would be an example of people who don't necessarily fall in line with the progressive mainstream are not going to be included in companies, regardless of their skills.
That's fine. I mean, I think it's okay in a meritocratic sense. It's okay to discriminate against somebody who demonstrates a lack of skill. I think a lack of ethical acumen would be another fair candidate for discrimination. Um,
So to be clear, I'm talking about people who might be able to generate the company like a degree of value, a high degree of value, but are passed over for the position because they don't hold the same progressive ideas that the company does, even if that doesn't actually affect their economic output. That would be an example of like very much not a meritocracy, which it sounds like you would agree with is like a good thing. And I would say that like in a capitalist economic framework, sometimes the thing that like produces the most money is a heroin den or a social media platform which gets people terribly addicted and doesn't benefit their lives. Sometimes that's the economically beneficial thing to do, and just hiring people based on their ability to achieve that is not what's going to create the best thing for society. And in that case, you might want to select employees for something other than economic productivity and instead maybe for something like self-sacrificing ability. I think that you could have environments where that's the case. But I think that like you would say that there are some circumstances in which economic productivity, their skill, is not what you want even companies or society to elevate people to positions of power over, right?
well, certainly. I mean, I'm a socialist. I wouldn't want that to be the sole determiner. Right now, it is. Making your shareholders back as much money as they can. Um, but
Wait, wait,
obviously,
wait, wait, wait. You would say that's the main determiner is making
right now
shareholders whole.
that is what determines what companies hire. Yeah, obviously there are biases within like any company that's going to influence that, but that's the thing they're pursued towards. That's the incentive structure, is to make the money back. Of course, I'm not fond of that. I'd be much happier with some regimented system of government oversights that introduced a number of incentives that are not profit driven. I think that would be lovely. But that's not the world that we live in right now.
Okay. Maybe we're just like continually speaking past each other because that's what I think of when I think of meritocracy. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily like the best thing ever to have this like pure skill based selection for people entering into companies. But I would say that like when I talk about meritocracy, What I mean is that people are being hired and promoted based on their ability to deliver value for the company, right? Their skill is reflected in where they move in the company and their compensation. And that is determined by their ability to return money to the shareholders.
That's absolutely not meritocratic. What if you had a racist society and you decided to only hire white frontmen for your business so that the racist clientele in that area wouldn't be put off by having a black employee there? And you didn't hire black employees because you knew they would generate less profit because they would disincentivize racist white people from attending the store. That decision would produce the greatest profits for the company, but I'm not interested in corporate profits as the measure of meritocracy. That's insane to me. It would be the level of availability and access from everyone to whatever it is they need in society, whether that be a job or access to resources.
Yeah. So when I talk about meritocracy, what I mean is that like their skills are being reflected in their compensation. And so like you can have this in a sense in a racist society, but the other side of that coin is you have like a lot of black people. I think that was like black people is the example that you were giving, who are systematically denied ability to even demonstrate their skills. And so even if like racist clerks are generating profit for a specific store, you've got this section of society that is unable to generate, the value that they're actually capable of producing. And therefore you'd measure the society as like not meritocratic because a significant portion of the society isn't able to, do as much as they are capable of.
Like the janitor.
Yeah, and so I would say that like in our current society, if like a janitor is able to, you know, have great managerial skill, companies have a lot of incentive to discover that and to promote that person up. I don't think that
How would they
happens.
know?
Yeah, I don't think that happens very often because companies have decided that like the chance of a janitor having significant managerial skill is low enough that they don't want to like actively seek that out. So they're waiting for the janitor to demonstrate that in some way, either by going and getting education or, proving through some other means that they have that skill. So I think they're doing that calculus, but they are doing the calculus because ideally they do want to make as much money as possible.
You place way too much stock in the effectiveness of these incentives. If these incentives were relevant, we wouldn't have massive biases in who receives how much pay or who gets to the top of any given field or industry. The people who make these hiring decisions are not brain geniuses. They're quaalude, choking, cocaine snorting pedophiles. They are not looking over the janitor and thinking, how can we psychiatrically analyze this person to make sure they have the managerial skills necessary? This just doesn't happen. People hire from outside the company, or they promote people they know the best, or people who will stir the boat the least. As far as I'm concerned, a meritocracy is when everyone is given the greatest possible ability to shine. And in a world where, if you take a look across California, you'll find millions and millions of people making the exact minimum wage and no more. My belief that every single one of them deserves that amount and none of them deserves something greater is just it's unsustainable. I cannot believe such a thing. So yeah, if we want to improve our meritocracy, we have to acknowledge its faults on a systemic level, socially, making sure people have access to the resources they need in order to be able to, express themselves and actualize their abilities. And within any other institution, which is one of the reasons why I'm a favor of worker co-ops, because I think democracies are a relatively effective venue for allowing people to shine in that sense.
Interesting. I think this conversation is very weird for me because I feel like we essentially agree on a lot of things, but are like using language in very different ways. Because like I also want people to be able to demonstrate, the value and capability that they have. I don't want, to lose Einsteins to bad economic conditions. But I would say like that is like a legitimate point where we can be like, the world could be better at finding, selecting people who are highly skilled and promoting them. And I would say that like the fact that companies are self-interested and they want to generate profit, and their ability to generate profit allows them to push out other companies that have other goals. So if you have a company that is very moral, goals, those goals, whatever the ethics they may be, are going to get pushed out from the market by companies that don't have those goals. And if a company has like the goal of hiring people only who are 6 foot plus, they're going to have a hard time in whatever industry they are in compared to a company that doesn't necessarily have that. And so the degree to which you have like these
What if they
biases,
what if they just selectively promote tall people?
yeah, again, it's like if you are having a company that has this like goal that is external to profit, that is going to impede on the company's ability to compete with any company that doesn't have that external goal.
Those companies are on the S&P 500. Those studies that I referred to about in-corporate bias weren't being done at like mom and pop shops. These are being done at the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Clearly, these biases, you can go back to the 1950s when it was legal to not hire black people, or, like just say not to. Plenty of very powerful corporations just didn't. Clearly, it didn't affect them that much. Clearly the more rational corporation didn't jump in and compete them out of business with their less discriminatory hiring practices.
I disagree. Absolutely. I disagree so much. I mean, like if you look at like companies today, they tend to be very interested, especially big companies like the ones you're talking about, in reducing as much as possible this bias. Like they're very, if you get hired at one of these big companies, my girlfriend recently got hired at a company that's fairly big, and a lot of like the onboarding process is like specifically targeted to make sure that any biases are being corrected for, again, because like these companies are self-interested, and
You keep
maybe
speaking of incentive, but it's just irrelevant to me. Like businesses have been incentivized to make the most money for as long as they've existed. Kingdoms were incentivized to prolong the rule of their kings for as long as they could. Magnates, trade companies, all of these incentives, and yet what happens? War and death and plague and fire and discrimination. The idea that what
well, what
incentive
happens
was
is
there for the
less
Holocaust?
discrimination over time, because
That I agree with, but we still have it. Enough of it that I can't consider this a meritocracy.
okay, yeah, maybe like you don't draw like the meritocracy line now, but I think that like we have to like fundamentally agree that like there's a push towards working this bias out because the bias is inefficient.
There is a push towards resolving some types of biases, like appearance biases, demographic biases in hiring in corporations. There isn't a push to fix the bias within accessibility to income and education and what have you on the ground level. We have record levels of income inequality, and there isn't a push to fundamentally restructure the unfairness of our existing economic system. I just want to ask something because I do have to end soon. I didn't expect us to go for so
Yeah,
long.
sorry.
No, no, not at all. If you had a mega factory, just some huge factory, I don't know, a sweatshop, with 10,000 workers, and the only three things you could be in that factory are workers, managers, and then the owner. And there are three managers and an owner. So there are four people in executive positions and 9,900, whatever. Basically, everyone is a worker, and there are very few people on top. If such a factory existed, and through omniscience, through genius and omniscience and pure profit-driven motive, the best people from the worker pool were pulled into the management and the owner positions. So the four out of the 10,000, the best of them always were put to the positions appropriate for their skills. Would you consider such a system to be a meritocracy?
I would consider that company's policy to be meritocratic. And I think that maybe the point that you're making is that even if companies have within themselves a meritocratic policy, the broader society, which allows people to enter into that company in the first place, might itself not have a high degree of meritocracy.
Absolutely, yes. And there would be such variance amidst the workers that any perception of meritocracy would be irrelevant. You would have tremendous variance in skills and abilities of all the workers on the ground level, and no way of differentiating them or putting them in places that they would be more comfortable because the structure itself is broken. I feel the same way about corporations. They have a pyramid structure, top down, small at the top and large at the bottom. And without a democracy, that is such a system, one in which no matter, even if somehow you could guarantee the best people are in management positions, that doesn't change the fact that there is a tremendous pool of very different people with no will to express at the bottom being treated the same. And I don't consider that meritocratic either.
Yeah, okay. So I think maybe that we can end on like a point of common ground. I would say the extent to which, a broader society doesn't allow potentially skilled people to enter into businesses in which they are rewarded for their skills, that is to the extent that a society is not meritocratic. And I think that like I am also very critical of the existence of meritocracy in the United States. But I would also acknowledge personally that the United States, historically speaking, is much more meritocratic than many other societies, like, feudal Europe, or, going back further. A lot of these kingdoms are very not meritocratic, and they basically rule through aristocracy and royal bloodline. And even dictatorships today, which don't have an incentive to educate their people because they want to just like continually exploit them for as much profit as they can, and educating them at all would be a threat to their political stability. I think that you have to compare the United States to much of human history and say that relatively speaking, it's more meritocratic.
Well, sure, I don't disagree with that. You set the bar kind of low, though. I still wouldn't consider it a meritocracy.
Okay, yeah. I mean, again, I think we agree on like so much of it, but I think maybe we're just describing things a little bit differently.
And we certainly have the bars in different places. All the same, I did enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely fun. I think you're very fun to talk to because you disagree with me, and it's fun to talk to people who disagree with you but are polite about it and are capable of engaging in long form conversation.
Well, I don't often get polite conversations, but I do like disagreeing. Thank you. I have to run and go do some errands really quick before they close. Have a wonderful day.
You as well. Have a wonderful day, Vaush. There are so many moments where I wanted to like dig in more, but I was just like, I could feel that it wasn't going anywhere. And that we were sort of like getting bogged down in things.